Hi, I'm John Nunn, and this is another video in the series of retrospective videos in which I talk about some of Gambit Publications' older books. Well, it had to come. With the permission of my colleagues, I have been allowed to devote one video to one of my own books, and I've chosen to talk about Learn Chess Tactics. This book was published in 2004 and has been a considerable success. In fact, it's not only the English language version which has been successful. The German translation, Einführung in die Schachtaktik, has in fact been more successful than the English. And it's hard to explain why the same book, just in different languages, should perform differently, but obviously I'm not complaining. The book does what it says on the cover, Learn Chess Tactics. It assumes that the reader knows chess notation, knows how to play chess, knows checkmate, and can handle very simple chess concepts, but wants to improve. And the quickest and surest way to improve at this stage is to learn chess tactics. And by a chess tactic, I mean a forcing continuation with a definite aim, such as mate or gain a material. Gain a material is the most common way for chess games to be decided. One player wins material, for example a piece, and then swaps the remaining pieces off to reach an endgame with extra material, which can then be converted into a win. The problem with this idea is obviously winning the material in the first place. And for the beginner it's quite confusing because there are different names for all kinds of chess tactics. Forks, pins, skewers, discovered attacks, and so on. Even though there are only a limited number of chess pieces, the way in which they can work together to produce what we call combinations is virtually unlimited. And so it may appear very intimidating. But in this book I attempt to introduce the ideas one by one, starting very simply. The first chapter is on forks, and each chapter starts with 3 pages usually of introductory material explaining the concept and giving a few examples, and then the rest of the chapter is exercises of gradually increasing difficulty, although to tell the truth none of the exercises is particularly difficult. Well, to give you an idea of the level required for this book and to decide whether this book might be suitable for you, I'd like to go through a few positions from the book. So let's go to the Gambit Chess Studio app, which is what I'm using to play over the positions. And this first position, I should add that all the positions are taken from practical games, often by masters and grandmasters. So these really are ideas which occur in real life. This is in the chapter on discovered attacks. And here we go. The text often gives you a little hint. Here it says, how did White set up a discovered attack with a preliminary sacrifice? Well, I'm going to pause here for a few seconds to give you a chance to think about this for yourself, and then I'll go through the solution. Okay, well, as the hint suggests, you first have to identify a possible discovered attack in the position. Now, a discovered attack is a geometrical tactic. It depends on a straight line arrangement of 3 pieces, 2 friendly pieces and 1 enemy piece. Here the 2 friendly pieces are the queen and the rook, and the enemy piece is the black queen. Now if the white knight were not on the board, White could move the rook to g7, taking the pawn and giving check. Black has to respond to check, presumably by capturing the rook, and then the white queen takes the black queen. So this is why it's called a discovered attack. The piece that's in the middle moves away and discovers or uncovers an attack from the rear friendly piece onto the enemy piece. The main issue here is how White can get rid of his knight so as to allow the discovered attack to actually occur. So let's click on the link and go to the solution. Well, the knight has to make a forcing move. If black is given time to respond, he can nullify the discovered attack in various ways, for example by moving his king into the corner. So it's most obvious, first of all, to look for a capture with the knight. But you have to be a little bit careful here. For example, if you take this pawn with the knight, black can take with the queen, and then the discovered attack no longer operates because the queen is not lined up with the white queen and white rook. So that doesn't work. And the same can be said for this capture on h7. So the correct capture, and the way white won the game, is to take the pawn on e6 with the knight, which not only wins a pawn, it also attacks the black rook. So black pretty much has to take, and now white takes off the pawn, we check, black takes back, and white wins the queen. White now has a queen and a pawn for a rook and a knight, which is a decisive material advantage, particularly if you take into account white actually has some positional advantages as well. For example, the powerful protected passed pawn on d6, and the fact that the black king is now quite exposed since most of its pawn cover has disappeared. So that was a two-move combination, a chess 1-2, which knocked out black. Black in fact resigned after the first move of the combination. And it shows how using these tactical ideas, which are standard, if you learn them, you can spot them when they appear in your games and use them to pick up some extra points. Now let's look at let's go to second bookmark, and we're going to look at this position. There's quite an important lesson to be learnt here. Well, the text gives you again a hint. It says if white plays pawn takes rook equals queen check, white would have winning chances. Yeah, white would then have a slight material advantage, rook against bishop and pawn. That might be winning. It's not easy though. But the question is, as it says, is there a better move? Again, I'm going to give you a few seconds to think about that. Right, well, one of the mistakes that's very easy to make in chess is to not make the most of your position. You may see a way to win some material, as white can do here. He's a piece down in the diagram position, and capturing the rook wins the rook for a pawn. So you might think, okay, I've then got a material advantage, rook against bishop and pawn, but it's not much, and it's going to be quite tough to win that position. So you shouldn't necessarily be satisfied with the easy pickings, and it's often worth looking to see if you can get more from the position than the most obvious move. And here white indeed has the opportunity to get much more out of the position than the simple capture of the rook. So let's have a look at the solution. And what Nigel Short actually played was he played the rather surprising rook takes g6 check. It's surprising. First of all, instead of taking the black rook, white sacrifices his own rook, and moreover, the rook can be captured in two different ways. But capturing with the f-pawn is not really a possibility. White then takes the black rook at a moment when the newly created queen is defended by the white rook, and therefore black is checkmated. And if he moves his king, again it's mate in one. So he pretty much has to take with the h-pawn. But now the white pawn on h6 plays a part. White pushes the pawn with check. Now you see black's in serious trouble. If he takes the pawn with his king, white takes the rook and makes a queen at a moment when black cannot recapture with his king because the king has been dragged away by the preliminary check with the pawn. So after this check, the only other real possibility is to move the king. But in that case, white again wins rather a lot of material by taking on f8 and then promoting his h-pawn. So however black plays, white ends up with a huge material advantage of a queen against not very much. So instead of ending up with a minimal material advantage, white ends up with an absolutely decisive material advantage. Indeed, in the actual position we have here, white is also going to take this rook with check, so it's even worse for black than it might appear at first sight. So again, it's not that deep, it's 3 moves deep really, but it's a question of using a bit of imagination to see how the sacrifice of the rook greatly improves white's chances as compared to the most obvious immediate capture of the black rook on f8. So there's a lesson there. This is in the chapter on pawn promotion, and you can see how in fact 2 different white pawns promoted during the course of the solution. But there's also an instructive point of extracting the most from an advantageous position. Let's now go on to the 3rd position. Okay, this is pretty much at the upper end of difficulty of the positions in this book. And you can see the position. And the text says, how did black exploit white's cornered king to win? Now, this is in the chapter on combinations, and combination really is the way in which different tactical elements can be combined, hence the name. So here we might expect to see more than one tactical element come into play, and there's a hint that it involves white's cornered king. And you can see that despite the material equality in the position, white is at a disadvantage because his king is very vulnerable. If black could give a diagonal check, for example with his queen, along this diagonal, the white king has no way out and white would be mated. But at the moment that's not possible because the white queen covers this square and the white bishop covers this square, so the black queen does not have a check on either of these 2 squares available. Well, black has to do something to change that situation, and the action starts in a rather surprising way. I'll give you a chance to think about it for a few seconds before we go through the solution. So I'm going to pause here. Right, well, let's have a look at the solution. I'll just follow the link. Well, if only the bishop weren't here, black would have this decisive check on e4, which in fact would be mate. And the bishop has a duty of covering the knight on b5, which may appear to be a bit of an irrelevant comment because this knight isn't actually attacked. But there's a lurking threat from this bishop. So if this knight weren't here, black could take this knight, the bishop would be deflected away to recapture, and then black would get the decisive check. So we're in a similar situation to the first position I showed you, where we have to find a way to get rid of this knight in a forcing way. Well, it's a mistake to play this move, because white can recapture with the knight, and then the whole thing just doesn't work at all. But the correct move, which is what black played in the game, is to take this pawn. Not only winning a pawn, also threatening this pawn and the bishop, so not a huge amount of choice here for white. He took back, and now black took on b5, so that if the bishop recaptures, black mates in 2. Queen goes in the way, queen takes queen mate. What actually happened in the game was that white tried to salvage as much as he could from the position by taking the pawn and at the same time giving the king some air so that it's not mated along this diagonal. But white's position was shattered, and black just exchanged and gave a check. Now if the king moves here, black takes this pawn with check and then takes this pawn as well, winning 2 pawns for nothing. So what actually happened was that white put his bishop in the way, so that when black takes this pawn it's not anymore check, and white has a chance to defend the second pawn with his queen. But the bad position of the white king is still a major factor, and black zoomed in with his queen, moving the queen to a more active position and again threatening this check on e4. White, for the second time, tried to give his king a bit more air, but he was struck by a final tactical blow, which is quite nice. This time it was a skewer of queen and bishop, And white resigned here because if he now takes the bishop, black mates in 2, check, bishop has to go in the way, and it's mate along the diagonal after all. So if we just go back to the initial position for a moment, you may wonder, this is quite a complicated combination, you may wonder how you would find something like this. It's all the question of trying to imagine, what would change the position in your favour. What would change the position in black's favour would be to